here, nor the blue card procedure. So let me give Federica Mogherini the floor. Thank you, President. Before going any further, may I compliment you on your election to the presidency of this House. I feel certain that we will enjoy the wonderful cooperation we've already had.
One element that I fully share what my friends Mrs. Fotyga and Mrs. Corazza-Bildt raised in the Foreign Affairs Council on Monday. We will have the situation in Ukraine on the agenda with the foreign ministers, and that will be also our occasion to restate our full support to the country and to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. Now, coming to the issue on our agenda today, I would start by saying that Europe and the United States of America are tied by an old and deep friendship. Personally, I have always looked, and I still look, at the United States with great respect and admiration as a land where everyone can succeed, whatever their social, ethnic or cultural background. A land of opportunities, a land of hope and dreams. A country that has always been great exactly because it has always been open and has always been a champion of freedoms. As a good friend of the United States, I believe Europe has a duty to be clear, respectful and clear whenever a disagreement arises, especially when it relates to our fundamental values. And we certainly disagree with the executive order issued by the President of the United States on February 27th, as many in the US seem to disagree too. The executive order introduces a temporary suspension for a period of 90 days of the entry into the US of foreign nationals from 7 countries, as you know well: Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Iran, Somalia, Libya and Yemen. It is also foreseen a temporary suspension for a period of 120 days of the US refugee admissions program. In principle, so no new refugee application can be accepted until the US Secretary of State, in conjunction with the Secretary of Homeland Security, reviews the current application process. There have been questions on which citizens are affected by the travel ban, and I would like to tackle this issue immediately and then focus on what to me is even more important. The US Department of State has clarified yesterday that the citizens of the European Union will not be affected by the ban, even if they hold dual citizenship in one of the 7 countries listed in the executive order. We welcome this clarification, but let me be absolutely clear, this does not change our overall assessment about the executive order. I have already made clear in the last days where the European Union stands on this. No one can be deprived of his or her own rights because of their place of birth, their religion or their ethnicity. This is written in our constitutions, both in Europe and in America. This is who we are, this is our identity, this is something we cannot forget. Our European history has taught us to celebrate when a wall is torn down and the bridge is built. We learned from our own great but also tragic history that every human being is first and foremost a person with fundamental rights that cannot be put into question. And let me add, from a personal point of view, I found it really sad to learn that this executive order was issued on January 27th, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. That is first and foremost a day to commemorate millions of Jews killed by Nazism, but also to reject any discrimination and to reflect on our duty to host those who flee from persecution and protect them and their rights. Many of them, most of them actually, are fleeing from terrorist groups such as Daesh. They are victims of terrorism. And beyond being refugees, they are men and women and children with personal stories, dreams and fears and profound wounds. And most of all, they have a future to build, also for the sake of their own countries and our own security. because the social reconstruction of their countries depends on them. So let me, actually I should say, let us be very clear. The European Union will not turn back anyone who has the right to international protection. This is where we stand, this is where we continue to stand. It would not be moral, it would not be just, it would not be legal, and it would not be in our interest. Because this kind of measure has the potential to increase tensions and mistrust among people, among peoples and nations. When I say among people, I also mean among people in our own societies. And I'm worried by the trends we're seeing inside the American societies in these days. And that's why, with a lot of respect, I invited the President of the United States to pay attention to what is happening in his own country. Only respect and cooperation can make us more secure. Only respect and cooperation can help us manage the many crises around the world. This is the European way. We work together with the countries experiencing a crisis and with their neighbours, all of them. A travel ban can maybe give a temporary illusion of addressing the issue, but it can only create more frustration and anger. We need cooperation, not closures. We need to engage. We need to build common ground, not to ban. The EU will continue to be a partner and a strong point of reference for all countries in the region, regardless of the religion of their citizens. They can count on us. And we will continue to be a partner and a strong point of reference for all those in the world that believe in international cooperation, human rights and rule of law. This is also why the European Union is the biggest donor in the world to the Syrian people and the neighbouring countries, with more than €9 billion invested since the start of the fighting in Syria. And so far, the European Union and the US have worked closely together, including at the UN Summit on Refugees in New York, because a global issue requires a global common work. Bold commitments were made to protect the human rights of all refugees and migrants and to counter hate speech against refugees and migrants. The EU is always ready to engage with the new US administration to follow up on these commitments, as well as on many other achievements we managed in these last years to build together, and that are today key fundamental elements of our European Union policy, from climate change to the Iran deal, from the Middle East peace process to our support to the UN system and a free and fair trade system. On the basis of this very clear international agenda, we'll work with the US administration as partners with full reciprocal respect. This is the European Union way. This is our principles, these are our values and our interests. And I believe we have a responsibility both towards our citizens and our partners in the region and beyond in the world to be true to our values and identity, show leadership and strength. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President. We now move on to the European People's Party group. Mr. Weber, you have the floor.
President, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
President, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking at travel restrictions today, but we all know that there's more to it than that. We very much support Ms. Mogherini's position on behalf of the Commission, but we're talking about more than that. It is true that Mr. Trump was democratically elected. We respect that, and we wanted to work with him. We want to build bridges, but we must express our respect of the outcome of the election. But when Mr. Trump says that he's combating illegal immigration, then we're on his side. When he says that he's fighting Islamist terrorism, we agree with him, and we're happy that after discussions with Angela Merkel and with Prime Minister May, he has said that he supports NATO. I'm glad about that. But that's not what we're talking about, because if we look at the activities and the statements of Mr. Trump over the last week, that's not what it's about. The US is supposed to be the country of freedom. It's supposed to be the country of immigration. That's the picture I've always had in my mind. And now we have this individualized suspicion of certain countries and certain peoples. And this just leads to hatred and xenophobia. The man who shot people in Ottawa referred to Trump. We're talking about president who is tearing up the TTIP. He doesn't want to have the Trans-Pacific Agreement. We want trade agreements. We want a fair world. Commissioner Malmström has made great efforts to strengthen trade by discussing Mexico, Japan, Canada and others. And the US was always a country of human rights, of fundamental rights, rights which people died and fought. And Trump is now standing up and saying that torture is efficient and he gives his people a free hand. Now, when a state uses torture, then that state becomes a criminal. So that must not happen. It's already been indicated today that there may be a new ambassador coming. We have one already. We have Nigel FARAGE here, but apparently it's another one going to come along who sees the euro as the end, and they're talking about the great independence of the UK so that they don't have to be part of the EU. But on behalf of my group, I would say that if we have to welcome an ambassador from the US who wants to see the end of the EU and who wants to see the end of the euro, then that person cannot be accredited. We cannot work with somebody like that. He wants a weak Europe. Trump is looking at the economy. He has America first, and he sees that Europe and China are the two major competitors. So he wants a weak and splintered Europe. And therefore, over the next weeks, months and years, we'll be looking at very fundamental issues, namely, can we stand together or not? With your permission, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to say that if we look at the history of the US, and if we look at the history of the United Kingdom, there are names like Roosevelt and Churchill. These were politicians who fought shoulder to shoulder for freedom against totalitarian regimes and against national egoism. Not because they were looking at their own countries, but because they were looking at values. Reagan and Thatcher managed to bring communism to its knees because that was the right thing for the world. These two pairs of politicians that I've mentioned fought for freedom in this world, and I would like the same thing to happen now. But Theresa May and Donald Trump, unfortunately, are looking out for their own interests, their own national interests, and not for the freedom of the world. I'd like to see a clear signal sent from a letter on Friday. The kind of signal Donald Tusk has already said. Le Pen says that the EU is protectorate of the US. I think the letter can show that that is not the case, and that Europe stands strongly for our own values. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Let me now give the floor to the Alliance of the Socialist and Democrats group, Mr. Pittella. Thank you very much, President. Well, let's tell the truth. Some people thought that Trump would basically be a joke. Instead of that, he's revealing himself to be a nightmare. Let's not underestimate what's going on here. Historically, when we've underestimated things and people, then we've ended up with dictators, people who have caused war and shed blood. Mrs. Mogherini said very correctly that our friendship with the people of America is not up for discussion. It's essential, it's fruitful, and it remains a firm point in our feelings and our actions. We continue to strongly admire the United States, what they've been historically and what they are today. But it's precisely because of that that it's so painful to note these proposals, these measures that are being taken by Trump. These are an attack on the European legal civilization. Let's say things as they are, Manfred. This travel ban aimed at the citizens of just a few Muslim countries has nothing to do with border management and fighting terrorism. This is a populist lie. Some people are being banned, others aren't. It basically depends on who Trump does business with. Let's say things as they are, because our citizens need clear words on this. This is an attack on the right to asylum and an attack on the rule of law. This is an attack, together with other things, the wall on the border with Mexico. I mean, this is an international country that's going to damage its relations with Mexico, with Latin America. The whole world's being affected by this virus that's being sown. Airlines, don't refuse to take people from these countries on your planes. Don't stop them travelling. Joe Linen's right here, as is Manfred WEBER, when they say, well, if this ambassador were appointed, well, then he wouldn't be welcome, because I can't welcome someone who, even before they're appointed, says I'm going there to destroy the European Union. Let me say to Mrs. May, to the UK government, do not play the Trojan horse to destroy the European Union. Don't take on that role. It would be good for member states to call their ambassadors for consultations with regard to what's going on in the United States. That would be a symbolic act, and it would also be a good thing. It would be a good thing also not to see Trump invited to Europe until this issue is resolved. Let me conclude by saying, like Mrs. Mogherini, I'm in favour of cooperation, but until Trump changes his line, the doors of Europe need to be closed in his face. Thank you.
For
the Conservatives and Reformist group now, Mr. Kamall, you have the floor.
Thank you. According to a study by the Cato Institute, a well-respected US think tank and a classical liberal think tank, since 1975, no American has been killed on US soil by a national from any of the 7 countries listed in President Trump's executive order. So those of us who believe that law should be fair, that there should be equality under the law, that the primary functions of law should be enforcement of contracts and social order, will rightly be concerned by this arbitrary ban, which affects not only Muslims, but also affects Christians fleeing persecution and war, and sending a message that there is some inherent contradiction between being a good Muslim and being a good citizen of a Western democracy, simply plays into the arms of Daesh and other extremists who make exactly the same claim. It plays into their arms because they make exactly the same claim when they are recruiting disillusioned and disconnected young Muslim men and women as terrorists. But whatever we in this chamber may think, the fact is that Americans voted for a candidate that said what he thought. And now they find that they have a president that does what he promised to do. So we must accept that this president, his priorities, and these policies are the consequence of a growing tide of discontent, to be found not only in Middle America, but also in many of our countries. Electorates that have lost faith in mainstream politicians on both sides of the Atlantic. Electorates that have lost trust in politicians' ability to listen and act upon their legitimate concerns. Electorates attracted by simplistic solutions offered by politicians on the edges of the political spectrum. And so while we express our concerns over President Trump's executive orders, we must also realise that as long as the gains from globalisation are seen only in the portfolios of company directors and not in the pay packets of workers, as long as our migration and asylum policies are seen as more about compassion, diversity and political correctness, and less about ensuring integration, we will find politicians pursuing similar policies and making electoral gains in France, the Netherlands and elsewhere in the EU. So every time a mainstream politician dismisses those who disagree with the current direction of political travel in Europe and America, every time you dismiss them as racist or populists, this simply demonstrates an inability to offer a credible alternative. In the meantime, no matter how strongly we feel about the current policies of the US President, let us all ask ourselves, what is more effective, the hotheads of protest or the cool head of diplomacy? And let us make it clear to our American allies that decisions of the new US administration in these executive orders, which lack the support of Congress, which are arbitrary, which have been purely planned without preparation for the consequences, will not make America great again, and moreover, will not strengthen, but only weaken our transatlantic relationship. And also let us remember that friends are more likely to pay attention to friendly voices of reason, not raised voices of anger. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. Now Mr. Verhofstadt for the ALDE group, please.
Has ended his intervention and also what Mr. Kamall started, but I don't understand something not of your intervention, Mr. Kamall. You're first of all saying, yeah, that is not done. And then you are saying two phrases later, but we have to accept it because he is elected. No, it is not because he is elected that he can go against human values and the values of the United States of America. Even an elected president with a majority, and he has no majority of the popular vote in the US, have to listen to the American Constitution, has to listen to the American judiciary. And that is my start of my intervention. In fact, people are saying, or some people are saying in the US, yeah, it helps security. Well, it's nonsense. You have given the figures. Since 1975, all terrorists in the US came from 3 countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Lebanon. None of them is on the list. It are 7 countries, and nobody came from that country since 1975 as a terrorist. So it's pure discrimination. And pure discrimination in a more broader approach, but because it's not only about this religious ban. It's about, fueling populism and nationalism for the moment, what the Trump administration is doing. And that's not only by appointing Mr. Farage as his spokesman here in the plenary, but it's also by having the idea to designate Malloch as the ambassador, and more important, let's be aware of that, Steve Bannon, member now of the National Security Council of the United States of America, a man who is openly saying we want a worldwide right-wing movement to get rid of the European Union, to get done with the European Union, and there they are sitting here. It's our 5th column, the 5th column, because Mr. Farage is working with Mr. Bannon. He sees him on a regular basis to, in fact, one thing, that's to see how the European Union can be destroyed in the coming years. Not thinking, dear colleagues, on one thing, it's a big risk to bet on nationalism and populism in Europe. We got that already in the past. We got already in the 20th century people who thought that nationalism and populism was the solution for our continent. And they have created the gruesome atrocities we have ever seen. 20 million deaths, Mr. Farage, have nationalism caused in Europe. And there is no family in the European Union who have not a grandfather of a grandmother or a son of a daughter who was not victim of that nationalism and of that populism. And that's the reason why we have created the European Union, to overcome that, to make a continent of peace. And I think what I see for the moment, that is an American president. Normally, what does it do an American president? Take Roosevelt, for example. He wanted to be the leader of the free world. I'm now seeing an American president who wants to be the leader of the fight against the free world, against solidarity and against tolerance. And I think it is an existential moment, Mr. President, for the European Union. We can only take one decision. We have the autocrat Putin who wants to divide Europe. We have President Trump who has a populist, nationalist view and wants to disintegrate us. We have the threat of the radical Islamists in the south, and we have a bunch of people here who want to destroy inside the European Union. We can do one thing, that is unite us, fight back as the European Union, and I hope in La Valletta it will not only be the letter, and I support the letter of President Tusk on this behalf, that will be the conclusion. I hope for once that all European leaders have the courage to stand up together with the European Parliament and fight back this bunch of nationalists and populists who wants to destroy us.
Zimmer. Thank you, Mrs. Zimmer. Now, for the GUI group, please.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. I'm sure this is not the first time, nor will it be the last time, that we discuss the policies of the United States, and more particularly of Mr. Trump. Thank you, Ms. Mogherini, for having established a link to the time when Mr. Trump signed his decree to stop the travel of Muslim citizens. It was the 27th of January. And it wasn't a matter of chance. It was quite deliberate. Because on the same day he insulted a person who talked about his ancestors dying in concentration camps, and he said he knew what it was like when people were being persecuted for their beliefs, and Trump said he was a bad actor. This is the kind of level of rhetoric we're going to hear, and if we're to convince that the European system has something to counter this, something to counter this lack of respect for human beings, then we've got to prove that we're better. In a tweet, it said that the European Union was a safe house for migrants. No, it's not. We've got to use our values, and we've got to have a proper migration policy so that people who are looking for protection are not considered the root of all evil, who bring terrorism to our lands. We've got to stay true to our values. Let me say once again, what would have happened to the post-war democracies after 1945 if a lot of the refugees who had been subjected to Nazism and were out on the roads in Europe, what would have happened if we had not looked after these refugees? How much would we not have missed them afterwards? And that alone should prompt us not to play this game. We shouldn't just counter the arguments, but we've got to prove that we have something to say, that there are things that we do better, and that we cooperate with those people in the United States who are out on the streets demonstrating. And the thing that really gave me hope these last few days is that on the day that Trump took office and the days afterwards, in the US and throughout the world, hundreds and of women spoke against this image of human beings. It's not just the lack of respect for women, but it's for the lack of respect for human beings generally, irrespective of nationality, faith, or country of origin. That's what we're talking about, and that's what we've got to push for. Let's combat Trump. Let us combat his ideology by stopping him from getting into a situation where he can hit the nuclear button. Let's make sure that we have security. Let's try and get the American force out of Europe. There's some in Germany which worries me.
Thank you. Mrs. Keller now for the Greens Group.
Thank you. The 45th President of the United States of America is truly opening a new chapter in the history of the US and in the history of democracy as well. And let's be very clear, this ban on 7 countries is not, something that's put forward for security or one or the other reasons. It's a very clearly discriminatory act. It's targeting Muslims, even though not only Muslims are hit, and even if it doesn't hit all Muslims. It is directed against people because of their religion. And who could have imagined that such a thing can happen? Who could have thought that the freedoms and the rights that we all assume are normal, natural, we've always had them, we think they're guaranteed, that they can evaporate so quickly, that they can disappear so suddenly. This is apparently how liberal democracy dies. It vanishes very quickly with an executive order. The US built itself on religious freedom. That was one of the key figures about its founding, and on immigration. And now what is left of this American dream? And how quickly did it vanish? But that's also the thing, isn't it? All the rights, all the freedoms, the liberties that we take for granted, actually they're not for granted. They always have to be fought for. They have to be fought for every single day. Democracy isn't something that, you set up, you write it into your constitution, and then voila, it's there. No, you have to defend it every single day. Same for human rights. They're never guaranteed. You have to work for them. And here in Europe, we pride ourselves of living in a union of peace, democracy and rule of law. We're proud to defend the idea of human rights in the world as well. But do we really do enough to safeguard those values? Don't we also restrict access at our borders? Don't we also have walls and fences? Do we not also, even in this chamber, sometimes hear people who discriminate against other people based on where they come from, based on their religion? And what are we doing about that? Every one of us, including the governments of the member states, need to be clear on which side do we stand. Do we stand on the side of hate and of walls, or do we stand on the side of democracy and of building bridges? I think we need to build our European Union stronger. And for that, we need to get our act together when it comes to finally solving the economic crisis that is still leading to so much unemployment, especially of young people. We need to coordinate our foreign policy. And we need to be champions of the international law, because there's not many other people out there in the world who will do it. We need to step up our role in the UN and also when it comes to climate change. Let us make Europe the countermodel to Trump, the light of liberty, of human rights, of rule of law, and also of generosity. Let us be the ones that show justice and compassion. And let us make sure we're not just speaking of those values, but we're actually demonstrating them in everything we do. The Statue of Liberty was once given by France to the younger sister, America, Sisters in Freedom and Rights. I think we should build more statues of liberty. We need to put them in Lesbos, in Lampedusa, where people arrive full of hope and fear. We need to put them everywhere where people are standing up for their rights and also for their neighbor rights. Let us be the Europe that brings forward, that champions those people who fight for the rights and the rights of others, no matter the nationality, their religion, their sex, their sexual orientation, no matter where they come from. Europe needs to be building bridges and not walls. Let us do that together. Thank you.
Grazie. Thank you very much. Mr. Farage now, on behalf of the FDD group.
Thank you. Well, I can see that you're all very upset here this afternoon, and I've no doubt that the events in the USA over the last few weeks have been a very profound shock to you. Perhaps you're right. You see, what has happened here is somebody has stood on a manifesto for election, got into office, and within 1 week said that he will hold faith with his own electorate. It is called genuine democracy. Unlike the system we have in the European Union, where the unelected commissioners like Mogherini here have the sole right to propose legislation. So I'm sure that it's a great shock to you to see that a genuinely elected Democrat is doing what he was put in to do. And it must be, I would think today in Washington. Sorry. I can't hear you, mate.
Di questo Parlamento e delle funzioni istituzionali.
This Parliament has institutional functions, as does the Commission, out of institutional respect to the Commission, but also as a result of the Commissioner's President. We need to be polite, please. So, thank you.
And out of institutional respect, President, to the truth, perhaps you will understand and agree with me that within the European form of lawmaking, it is the unelected Commission that have the sole right to propose legislation. If I'm wrong in saying that, you can throw me out of this Parliament right here, right now, this afternoon.
Mr. Farage, I am just asking you to be a little bit more respectful, please. Thank you. You may continue.
Oh, I'll be respectful, all right. And perhaps you will be too, for the right of the leader of a political party that won the European elections in the United Kingdom in 2014. Now, it seems to me that actually, with all the anti-Trump rhetoric that is coming from everywhere, actually what we're hearing is the true nature of the European project, which is genuine anti-Americanism. Trump is motivated by protecting the United States of America from Islamic terrorism, whereas what has happened in this room and in governments around Europe is you have welcomed these people into your own homes. But can we please, just for a moment, look at the facts? Amongst all the hyperbole and the hysteria, all that Donald Trump has done is taken 7 countries that were identified by President Obama as posing a risk to the USA. Obama already had put in place extreme vetting. What Trump has done is for 90 days to say, let's examine that vetting and see whether it's good enough. But I want to ask you, Mr. Verhofstadt, and all the others, with your faux outrage today, where were you when Obama in 2011 banned any Iraqi from going into the country for 6 months? Why do I hear no criticism in this chamber or from the Commission of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain and others who refuse to take a single, not one, refugee or displaced person from Syria? And how can it be that on Holocaust Day, last Friday, not a single one of you criticised the 16 countries in the world that ban Israeli Jews from even going to their country on holiday? What is this hypocrisy? So perhaps what we need to do, Mr. President, and through you to the members, perhaps what we need to do is to be a little bit more constructive. All of us here say we're Democrats. Well, here's a chance to prove it. Let us invite President Trump to come here to this European Parliament. I'm sure as Democrats you'd all agree that what we need to do is to have an open dialogue with the newly elected, most powerful man in the world. And if you throw that rejection back in my face, then you prove yourself to be the anti-democratic zealots that I always thought you were.
Could we have a microphone for the speaker, please?
Grazie, onorevole Verhofstadt.
Thank you, Mr. Verhofstadt. Mr. de GRAAFF now for the ENF group, please.
President, Mr. Tusk recently said that the United States of America is as great a threat to the EU as Russia and Islamic State. Is Mr. Tusk suffering from irrational anxiety, from panic attacks that disturb his view on reality? President Trump has rightfully introduced a temporary stop on the entry of citizens from countries that were already identified by his predecessor, Mr. Obama, and Mr. Farage said that already, as countries that pose a threat to US security. His argument to improve border controls before allowing people to enter is completely valid. In the EU, we are directly suffering from the consequences of a failing border control. We have suffered attacks in Brussels, Nice, Paris and Berlin, and many lost their lives or were severely injured. Trump called the EU a mess, and he's right. It is a mess. And the outcry against President Trump is pure hypocrisy. Mr. Farage already said that. Where was the protest against the exclusion of Israeli citizens by the same Islamic countries that are now banned from the United States? You should be ashamed of jeopardizing the lives of EU citizens because of the failing border controls in the EU. And I call upon Mr. Tusk and upon the Commission to follow the example of President Trump. Install national border control. Keep jihadists out, not just from the 7 countries that President Trump singled out, but of many more that are responsible for the wave of illegal migrants in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you. During Nigel Farage's speech, a member of the British Labour Party sat behind him with a sign all the way through, and not till the end did someone come down to deal with that. I trust that something will be done to discipline this member, because if not, I'll write my own sign and go and sit over there. It might say something like "sell out."
Onorevole Etheridge.
Mr. Etheridge, please. Mr. Etheridge, we sent the staff to tell the member that he was not entitled to hold up that sign. Now, Mr. Papadakis from the non-attached members, 1.5 minutes. Thank you. We can see the trends of capital here. These travel restrictions are a dangerous development. Thousands of migrants and refugees are the victims of the capitalist system, which is being managed by Trump. Now, this protectionism in the United States, as they square up to China and cozy up to Russia, entails a potential for conflict. At the same time, we have Brexit and the upsurge of Eurosceptics. Again, this is a facet of capitalism in Europe, which has not been successful. They're feeding on popular discontent. The peoples have to work out their own way forward to protect their own interests. They have to fight organizations such as the UN, NATO.
La sua replica, la Vicepresidente Mogherini.
Thank you. And now the Vice President, Ms. Mogherini, to answer to the debate.
Grazie anche per le parole.
Thank you, President, and thank you for your kind words.
Because I guess that might be better. I think that respecting the role of the Commission, and in particular then, in my case, of the Vice President of the Commission that is also a High Representative, is also a sign of respect for this Parliament, because I was asked to do this job by the European Parliament, that to my knowledge is elected, and by the way also by the European Council, that is composed of Prime Ministers that are elected, I guess. So, but I see that there is a lot of confusion also in the UK, in some parts at least of the UK. The United States are a great country, are a great democracy. America will have to deal with its own divisions and discussions. I know that as Europeans we are specialized in making every crisis our own crisis. I think this is clear. This is an American crisis that will have to be dealt by Americans, sorting this out somehow. Starting from the dangerous divisions and polarizations we are seeing in the American political, institutional and societal dynamics. But I'm confident that our American friends will find the way out of these tensions and crises and continue to be that great country that most of you recognize they are. They have been and they will continue to be. What is up to us here is not to try and solve the American contradictions of the present, but is to be clear on where we stand, reaffirm our own values, our own policies, our own interests, be true to them, perfectly right, those of you that underline this, be true to them. This is also up to you in this chamber and to many others in the European institutions. Be strong and show leadership. Because we might have lost one important partner on some files, but this makes our leadership even more important, relevant, and I would say indispensable. All around the world, being it in our region, being it very far away, people are looking at the European Union now, maybe not in the UK, but in the rest of the world, are looking at the European Union now as a point of reference when it comes to multilateralism, when it comes to free and fair trade, when it comes to human rights, when it comes to respect, which for us is the basis not only of institutional relations but also of human relations. When it comes to our own, in Italian we would say humanism, I'm not sure in English it works, but the Europeans are like this. Sometimes we are not proud enough of what we are and of who we are and what we can be. And I would now end by saying that some great Americans, good friends, only a few months ago, were reminding us Europeans, just here in Brussels, that Europeans should believe in themselves as much as their friends in the world believe in them. And I think that this is the time for us Europeans to realize the potential we have, to realize the responsibilities we hold in this particular historic moment, and to be that strong point of reference that the world needs in this moment, and in particular in our region. I was thinking of the paradox. We will have Prime Minister Farage from Libya tomorrow here. That was natural, and that invitation came before the executive order was out. But that's a Libyan citizen. And he will be here in Brussels discussing ways out of the Libyan crisis, here with us. When you ban something, when you build a wall, you might have the feeling that you're more secure, but you're actually building walls all around you, preventing yourself from many opportunities. Us Europeans are not like that. We will continue to be true to our values and to our way of working, the European way, which puts cooperation before confrontation. And I think we will have to be proud of that and do that even more. Thank you.
Grazie, Vicepresidente.
Thank you to the Vice President, Mrs. Mogherini, and thank you to everyone who's taken part in the debate. That item is now closed. The next item on our agenda is our debate on the Commission statement regarding the state of the Energy Union. We welcome Commissioner Šefčovič, and I give him the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Distinguished members, once again I would like to thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to present to you the second State of the Energy Union report only a few hours after it was adopted this morning by the College. As you may remember, the Parliament was one of my first stops in presenting the first report as well. And this is no coincidence. It reflects the importance I see in working very closely with you, the European Parliament, in co-piloting the Energy Union. Only through close partnership can we ensure that the legislative proposals of the November package will be adopted over the next 9 months. This is the objective I presented last week in the ITRE committee in line with the December declaration of our three institutions. A quick adoption is important so that our proposals can be swiftly transposed by the